It was a freezing cold evening. Snow was falling, and the streets were getting darker. It was the last night of the year. Out in this freezing weather was a poor little girl walking down the street. She didn't have a hat, and her feet were bare. She had left home wearing slippers, but honestly, they weren't much help. They were way too big because they used to belong to her mother. While she was hurrying across the street to avoid two fast carriages, she lost the slippers. One of them was nowhere to be found, and a cheeky boy grabbed the other and ran off. He laughed and said it would make a great cradle for a baby someday. Now, the little girl had to keep walking in the snow with her tiny bare feet, which had turned red and blue from the cold. She carried a bunch of matches in an old apron and held some in her hand. She had been trying to sell them all day, but not a single person had bought even one. No one had given her any money at all. Shivering from the cold and hunger, she walked slowly, looking so sad and helpless. Snowflakes landed on her long golden hair, which curled beautifully around her neck. But she didn't care about that now. From the windows of the houses, warm candlelight glowed, and the smell of roast goose drifted out. It was New Year's Eve after all. She could smell it and think about it, but that was all. In a little corner where two houses met, one sticking out more than the other, she sat down and curled up tightly. She pulled her little feet close to her, but no matter what, she just kept getting colder. She didn't dare go back home because she hadn't sold any matches and didn't have any money to bring back. She knew her father would hit her if she returned empty-handed. Besides, home wasn't any warmer. The roof above her was full of holes, and even though they had tried to block the cracks with straw and rags, the wind still blew right through. Her little hands were so cold that she could barely feel them anymore. She thought, if only she could light one of the matches, it would bring her some comfort. She was so cold, all she wanted was to warm her fingers. She took one match from the bundle, scratched it against the wall, and it flared up. Whoosh! It burned bright and warm, like a little candle. The light was so nice, and as she held her hands over it, it felt like she was sitting in front of a big iron stove with shiny brass feet and a pretty brass decoration on top. The heat from the stove felt so good. The little girl even stretched out her feet to warm them. But just as she did, the flame went out, and the stove disappeared. She was left holding only the tiny burnt-out match in her hand. She quickly took another match and lit it. It burned brightly, and where the light touched the wall seemed to disappear like a curtain, showing her a beautiful scene inside a room. On the table was a clean, white tablecloth, and there was a fancy porcelain dish set. The roast goose was steaming, full of delicious stuffing with apples and dried plums. But the best part was that the goose seemed to jump off the plate, walking around with a knife and fork stuck in its chest, until it came over to the little girl. But just then, the match burned out, and all she saw was the cold, damp wall again. She lit another match, and suddenly she found herself sitting under the most amazing Christmas tree. It was even bigger and more decorated than the one she had seen in the rich merchant's house through the glass door. Thousands of lights were shining on the green branches, and bright, colorful pictures hung from the tree, just like the ones she had seen in shop windows. The little girl reached out to touch them, but the match burned out. The lights from the tree floated up higher, turning into stars in the sky. One of the stars fell, leaving a long trail of fire behind it. Someone must have just died, the little girl thought. Her grandmother had told her that when a star falls, it means a soul is going to God. She lit another match, and in the bright light, she saw her grandmother standing there. She looked so peaceful and loving, glowing with warmth and kindness. "Grandmother!" cried the little girl. "Please take me with you. You always disappear when the match goes out. You vanish, just like the warm stove, the tasty roast goose, and the beautiful Christmas tree." She quickly scratched the whole bundle of matches against the wall, hoping to keep her grandmother with her. The matches lit up so brightly it was even brighter than noon. Her grandmother looked more beautiful and taller than ever. She took the little girl in her arms, and together they soared up, higher and higher, in a world full of light and joy. There was no more cold, no more hunger, no more fear. Only peace, and they were with God. But in the corner, as the first light of dawn broke, the poor little girl sat, her cheeks rosy and her mouth smiling. She had leaned against the wall, frozen to death on the last night of the old year. Her body was still, and in her hands she held the bundle of matches, one of which had burned out. She was just trying to warm herself, people said. No one knew the beautiful things she had seen, or the wondrous life she had shared with her grandmother as they entered a new year, full of joy.